Thank you for checking out our YouTube channel, and don't forget to subscribe and like. And please visit us at barrykibrick.com, where you'll see all the ways that you can become a patron of our mission and help us continue to build a community of seekers who quest for knowledge, information, and most importantly, wisdom.
Today on Between the Lines, the philosophical origins that inspired the American Revolution with Matthew Stewart. Welcome, I'm Barry Kibrick. Matthew Stewart is a best-selling author and philosopher who deeply researched the crucial concepts that motivated our founding fathers. With his book, Nature's God, he sheds light on the grand ideas behind the American experiment.
I'm a writer today because I was a reader when I was 11 years old, and it was...
You do not need to prove your state of happiness to anybody.
Most of these speeches were as much as a month in preparation.
Characters, the heroes in this book, are seekers of truth in a story that involves a lot of corruption.
I don't get a chance to really talk about what's real, and it's the purpose for me.
Matthew, it is a pleasure to have you on Between the Lines. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here, Barry.
I want to begin because when you start off the book, you say that our founding fathers, by many of their, I guess the people that the masses, so to speak, but not only the masses, but even, as you say, there's as many arguments amongst our founding fathers as there were amongst everybody else in the country at the time, but they were known as infidels. They were known as atheists. But the truth is, they are actually deists. And throughout the book, you give us a very clear description of what deism is, how it affected their philosophical thought, even about the revolution, which is where this big tie-in comes in. It's not just about breaking away from Great Britain. It's about also a complete different philosophical outlook on life. And I think people are unaware that that was part of this equation. We're always taught that it is strictly no taxation without representation. It was the subjugation under the crown, but it's not. It was, to our founding fathers, mostly in their hearts, a philosophical revolution of thought.
Well, that's an excellent point, Barry, or a series of points, and I want to try to address some of the ones that you mentioned. Let's see if I can do it in order. A first point to bear in mind is that we're talking about heretics here. So even before we get to the fact that they're deists, the curious fact is that America's founders were not comfortable with the organized mainstream religion of their time. Deism happened to be one variety of heresy or heterodoxy at the time, but it's curious that they had this character because, in fact, if you look at subsequent generations of American leaders, you will find that by and large they try really hard to blend in, and you have no reason to doubt that they're not heretics. But in the case of America's founders, there's just no doubt that they were infidels or irreligious in a certain sense, even if they were religious in another sense. For them, this radical philosophical position was more than just a sort of passing fashion. It was more than just what the intellectual elites were doing in Europe or in America. It was deeply connected with what I like to think of as the revolutionary part of the American Revolution. This goes back to a very simple distinction that Thomas Paine made and then Abraham Lincoln later picked up. It's that the American Revolution would not have been terribly interesting if it was just a question of setting up a separate country. If it was just, let's claim our independence and not pay taxes to the British, well, frankly, it would be just, one of thousands of similar stories in American history. But it involved a significant change, a change in the way human beings govern themselves. It actually was an attempt to address this fundamental question: can human beings govern themselves? And to try to answer that question and come up with a solution to that problem, America's radical philosophers turned to this body of philosophy that we can call generally deism or deism. And that has a long history. Shall I go into the...
We'll go into all of it, I promise. You take us back all the way to BC in this case, from Epicurus to Lucretius. You take us all the way back as we learn about how these philosophies came about. But let's clear up a little bit of the deism, because in a sense, they are, as you said, in a very unusual way, deeply religious. In fact, the deism or deism, in a sense, is a certainty rather than a faith. And in fact, that was part of the interesting the reason why the church didn't quite grab onto it was, wait a minute, you can't be certain there is a God, you have to have faith there is a God. These guys were certain. There was something that started this movement, and we are endowed with rights based on not some sort of revelation, but based on the natural way we have began to grow our intellect. So there was more of a certainty than a faith, and that's kind of an interesting spin on it.
Yes, that's right. And I think the key words that you're mentioning are nature and reason, because that's what's opposed to revelation. And so we're talking about a deity, which is a deity, but one that answers to nature and reason as opposed to revelation. So that's a really fundamental point that's going on in the deism of America's revolutionaries.
Now, one of the gentlemen that is the unknown, as you say, founding father. Everyone needs a favorite unknown founding father. Yours is, or a forgotten founding father, yours is a fellow named Thomas Young. And this was truly not an elitist. He was, like Ethan Allen, another one, they were closely associated together. Ethan Allen, as you said, we know because of the furniture chain, but he's also a little bit relegated down on the totem pole of founding fathers. But Thomas Young is almost never heard of, and yet he was truly the non-elite who thought this way. And both were mountain men and that kind of individualism that seeped in to the consciousness of the American culture.
Yeah, I think we need to ask ourselves, why do we elevate certain members of the revolutionary generation and make them special, make them count as our founding fathers and not others? So Thomas Young, just to introduce him briefly, because he is my hero and he represents a forgotten part of the revolution. What are the key reasons why he's been forgotten? What's special about him? A couple of really important things. One is that he represents a democratic part of the revolution. So he's a man of the people. He stands up for the people. Sometimes you hear the story that the American Revolution was a conservative one, or that it didn't involve a significant change in the way society is organized. But Thomas Young contradicts that completely. Thomas Young was a man of the people, fighting for the people. He was trying to expand suffrage. He was arguing for forms of wealth redistribution. He was a genuine political radical. The other curious thing about Thomas Young is that he was an infidel, and explicitly so, and in a very public way. And I'll tell you one of the stories that makes me regard him as one of my great heroes. You know, he was known to be an infidel, known to be a deist, and yet he was intensively involved in the political activities of the time. So, for example, he served on the Boston Committee of Correspondence. The reactionaries of the period, the Tories and the extreme representatives of religion, opposed him. They got up and said, we can't work with this committee because it's full of infidels, like Thomas Young and a number of others. And the committee members got together and they said, we need to keep him here, we need to defend him. So they wrote these beautiful letters defending him. And in these letters they say, Thomas Young has worked incredibly hard for our cause. He has a lot of friends in very high places, a very good character everywhere he goes, and he goes lots of places, despite the fact that everywhere he goes he says exactly what he thinks. And in that sense, he represents something central to the American character and to the American Revolution, the man who's willing to speak truth to power. But it's precisely for that reason that he's forgotten. He's forgotten because he was heterodox. He was not part of the accepted way of believing and doing things.
And it seems like our founding fathers, to their brilliance, I know that although it puts Thomas Young as forgotten, but to their brilliance, they knew that they had to downplay the radical thought because they had to bring in the masses, many of them still believers. And by the way, not that our founding fathers weren't believers. They were just not believers in, as you say, the orthodoxy of what was going on at the time, nor did they believe that man didn't develop this nature and reason rather than it being revealed. But they were smart enough. They knew that they had to almost be above pious in a certain way to attract the masses. And in a real way, I don't think they were being hypocritical. I really believe that through their knowledge and wisdom and reason, they really epitomized what it is to be virtuous, pious, because that is what they knew was right.
Well, you're getting at a very important theme here for me, and it's the connection between the radical thought that inspires these people and the moderate exterior with which they present it to the world. And this, in a way, is the central enigma of deism and why it's so effective and at the same time so elusive, because it appears to be much more conventional and much more religious in a traditional sense than it in fact is. And that's a key part of its success. But as you say, that doesn't mean that it's hypocrisy. That doesn't mean that it's just some kind of subterfuge. In fact, what you find is that there's a sort of continuity almost between the radical expression that gets at the really fundamental issues and the different forms of expression that work with different groups of people in accomplishing the revolutionary goal. And they accomplish this in part by being able to construct a language that meant a number of different things to different people, but that still remained rooted in this radical philosophy.
Well, in fact, you make it very clear that the religious enthusiasts and the radical infidels or deists, or however we wish to put it, they really do make this great team, in fact. In fact, there were comments where it couldn't have even happened if both of them weren't together to a certain extent, because they pushed not only for the freedom of religion, but the freedom for religion and the freedom from religion. And it was only through this unique bond that they really did have. Again, it's not a hypocritical bond. It's a true bond that everyone was aware of, really helped the cause.
That's right. So the enthusiasts are basically the people who feature in the Great Awakening. There's the first Great Awakening in the 1730s and 40s in the colonies, and then there's another major one in the early 19th century. And similar movements were happening in other parts of the world, but they represent something very important, a fundamental change in society and in the way things work in the early modern world. And that's a change in the power of the individual, basically. I mean, you have individuals saying, I'm going to take charge of my salvation. I'm going to sort of pursue my own religious path. I'm going to get rid of the religious authorities. There's a great metaphorical representation of the kind of anti-authoritarian aspect of this movement when you have one man who doesn't like his preacher, and so he goes to the church and he hacks out the pew, his family pew, and brings it back home. Says, I'm going to have my church at home now. And this is a classic gesture of the enthusiasts and the awakeners. These people then played a crucial part in the revolutionary struggle because they contributed to the quest for religious freedom. So they provided the crucial backing for votes in Virginia and then also votes for the First Amendment to establish religious freedom. At the same time, their system of ideas is not exactly that of the philosophers. They represent something very important in American history. They represent something very important in the evolution of the modern world. But to understand what was really happening and to put it together in a single piece, in a single movement, that's where you need the revolutionary philosophers. So that was their contribution. They were much smaller in numbers, these revolutionary infidels, but they provided the key theoretical foundation for what eventually became not just the freedom of religion, not just the freedom of these people in these different sects to try to exercise their own religion, but also to some degree a freedom from religion. That is an ability to organize our society in a way that doesn't depend on any particular religious creed at all. And it was that partnership that ended up being very important, but they were very distinct contributions.
But the big contribution, according to me, so from what I read from The World According to Barry, but from your book, Matthew, and as I said, you go back to some of the let's be clear, the philosophers that are really directly influencing our founding fathers are people like those from the Enlightenment, everyone from John Locke to Spinoza to Descartes to those. Those philosophers, however, go back and are influenced all the way back to BC from people, as we spoke a little bit before, Epicurus and Lucretia. And the thing that Epicurus brings out, which then travels through, that I find the real key where we are looking about humanity's break from this hierarchy, and that has to be the pursuit of happiness. And that has to be, in my opinion, the most defining difference in the founding document than in any other founding document of a declaration of any sort, and that is that pursuit of happiness. But happiness must be understood the way these founding fathers did, and I go back to what they had to be the most of. That was happiness through virtue. It wasn't a happiness due to a sort of hedonism where anything goes, you want to do this, you want to do that, doesn't matter. No, this was really through a deep understanding of what it meant to be good, to be virtuous. I mean, as deep as the religious philosophy of the Golden Rule. And even, if you can go even deeper, they would have gone deeper to that core.
Well, I think you're, once again, you're I've got a number of very important issues here that are going on in the philosophical prehistory of the American Revolution. So one of my main goals is to try to convince you and my fellow Americans that the American experiment has a long prehistory in human civilization, that this is something that has been building up for a long period of time, and that you can, in fact, trace it back to these ancient Greek roots. I think in ancient Greece there was a form of enlightenment. What are the key aspects of that enlightenment? Well, you're getting at a key point when you say it's the pursuit of happiness. I think that the core of the Epicurean philosophy is the idea that it's a this-worldly philosophy. So it's a philosophy that says whatever happens and whatever is important to you, all of it can only take place within the world that we experience. So we cannot know anything, we cannot infer anything, we cannot base anything on the notion of some other world. We can, that doesn't mean that we know this world perfectly, but we have to ground ourselves in it. So that leads to a pursuit of happiness, as happiness being the understanding that we basically want to realize ourselves. But there's another side of this story, and that's that Epicurus, despite his infamy as a kind of hedonist, is in fact, to some degree, a rationalist. I mean, to some degree, he's saying that whatever happens in the world answers to certain laws of cause and effect, that the world is explicable, that we can put the pieces together. And then it becomes clear that the pursuit of happiness and the pursuit of understanding of the world actually becomes something like the same thing, that in order to really find happiness, we can't just go out and pursue the urges that immediately come to mind, just satisfy whatever craving hits you. That, as we all in fact know, is a source of unhappiness. True happiness comes from understanding, and it's not just understanding yourself and your own impulses, because you are just another piece of this world. You're just something that also has to be explained. It also means understanding the world. Now, if you put this happiness and understanding together, that ultimately produces the concept of virtue. So this is something that appears in ancient Greece. You could argue that it appears in the philosophy of Socrates, although it's hard to know since he never wrote anything down. And it appears in a certain form in the Epicurean philosophy. When the Epicurean philosophy is revived in the early modern period, this unity of happiness, wisdom, and virtue becomes very important. And the philosophers that mattered for Jefferson, for example, were quite explicit about it.
Well, and it's funny too, because through this, and although you wouldn't call it monotheism, because they're not being in the theistic tradition, it still is a monistic philosophy that they have, a oneness, all out of one sprang from all. And there is, even at the early stages, and even amongst, by the way, I think what I found most fascinating, and I want to share this, is I had no clue how deeply philosophical the writings were between our founding fathers. They got so deep into so much. It is, again, we don't catch that as much during our regular education. We catch oftentimes their political philosophies and debates, but we never see this in this kind of depth. And I bring that up because they're not even ruling something out that may be transcendent from us. They're just believing that it is what we're doing here that's going to matter. And if there is an eternal soul, because that comes up in the conversation, and they back it up through science that nothing can be created or destroyed, then again, that eternal soul still is going to be based on the virtue of virtue, in, as you described, being really the desire to crave wisdom, seek wisdom of not only our world, but of our universe.
Yes, that's right. Well, let me say that one of the things that brought me into this world 10 years ago was just this fascination with the philosophical writings of our founders that you mentioned. My background is in the history of ideas and the history of philosophy, and I had always looked down a little bit on the American revolutionaries as being not particularly interesting, philosophically speaking, however important they were politically and historically. But about 10 years ago, I started reading their writings. I read Ethan Allen's wonderful and slightly crazy book. I came across Thomas Young, but I also read the works of some of the more famous founders like Thomas Jefferson. And I was blown away. I was astonished. I mean, their degree of sophistication and their passion for this subject was really incredible. I mean, it's hard to imagine a couple of American presidents exchanging the kinds of letters that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson exchanged for nearly a couple decades toward the ends of their lives. I mean,
I was envious about that. In fact, I mean, were you not when you were? I was reading the book. I was going, why aren't we corresponding like this today?
I know,
it seems it's not. It's still it's maybe more valid now than it even was 250 years ago.
I get a little envious of Jefferson because I'm a writer and I try to write as well as I can, but then I read his letters where he's written by hand, so I can see that he's just sort of dashed it off. Sentences that I would kill for.
And hundreds of thousands of pages worth of sentences.
They keep coming.
It's nonstop. It's amazing.
But let's tie that also to this other thing that we were discussing, the sort of the pursuit of happiness and the this-worldliness. Some of those philosophical writings can be quite shocking if you really think them through. So Thomas Jefferson, writing to James Madison, says, the earth belongs in usufruct to the living, and the dead aren't even things. They're just particles that are dispersed and assume different shapes. So the dead have no rights on this earth. I mean, it's an incredibly life-centric, this-worldly-centric form of philosophy. It's very much an affirmation of being. And, I think, frankly, it tends to a kind of pantheism where essentially you are just affirming being itself, it's an attitude of gratitude towards the existence in its most general form, without any attributes at all, just pure existence, and that whatever we can mean by a deity or a god, it's indistinguishable from this being.
The one thing that I think adds even another dimension to that, if I might, is that there is this notion of this rugged individualism that stems from a lot of the philosophers that exist and the founding fathers in particular, and yet there's an awareness that without cooperation you can't really achieve the individual freedom. There was this notion that the human species, based in reason, not based in faith, has one, as you say, noteworthy feature: the gain in power it experiences through cooperation. And that, I think, is another thing that makes this such a unique brand of American philosophy, so to speak, and that is this severe belief in the individual's rights, and yet note that there must be cooperation amongst us in order for us to bring them out.
Yes, you're getting at what I think of as the foundations of the theory of natural right properly understood. So the founders did subscribe to a version of natural rights theory, and that has been, I think, seriously misunderstood in recent times. I think when that term is used now, it's usually meant to suggest that individuals have these kind of innate rights implanted perhaps by some deity, and these are basically entirely antisocial. They're just, it's me, it's mine, and I got it, and I'm gonna, I owe nothing to anybody else. That seems to be one of the theories of what happened in the American Revolution. But if you go back and read what people like Jefferson were writing concerning natural rights, in fact, you understand that our natural rights arise from the conjunction of two very simple facts. One is that human beings are basically equal in terms of their power, or at least in terms of their potential to contribute. And the other is that we have a tremendous amount to gain from cooperation. In fact, so much to gain from cooperation that there's almost no point in talking about us as individuals. And the founders understood that really it's the two together, the individual side and the collective side, that produce natural rights. We respect one another's rights precisely because we know that we need to work with one another.
Well, you know, the one thing that our founding fathers knew more than anything was it was all in the balance. How can we balance this? They did an amazing job, and I want to thank you, Matthew, for enlightening us about the balance and the difficulty that was required for it to be achieved. Thank you, Matthew, so much.
Oh, thank you, Barry. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure, and thank you all for joining us. Now, before Matthew leaves, I'd like to leave you with these words from nature's God. To be free, it is necessary first to know oneself, and to know oneself, it is necessary first to know the world. The long and arduous path to freedom passes through the continuous improvement of our knowledge of ourselves and of our entire universe. I'm Barry Kibrick. Between that long and arduous path to freedom, continue to improve your knowledge, and we will improve our world. Thank you so much, Matthew.
Thank you, Barry.